There have been several ages of man before our age, each ending in a horrid catastrophe that killed the sun, which could only be replaced once a god sacrificed himself. Once the fourth age ended, one boastful god offered himself, but was too afraid to follow through. So, a meek, humble god sacrificed himself instead. And so began the fifth age, where we now reside. People had been living in Mesoamerica for many years, originally coming to the region as hunter-gatherers, and eventually developing into stationary agricultural societies, farming mainly beans, corn, and squash. The first civilization of note coming from these societies was the Olmec Civilization, which began in the tropics of the Gulf of Mexico around the Coatzacoalcos River. Due to the dependence on this river, the Olmec people were centralized and were concentrated around it. This concentration led to a class-based society with a nobility who enjoyed luxuries such as jade and obsidian that are only found in other parts of the region. This allowed for the civilization to become the largest trading hub of Mesoamerica at the time. Soon the Olmec capital was abandoned, with many different theories for the reasoning behind it, like an uprising of the people due to evidence of building destruction, or change in river flow. Either way, their capital shifted from San Lorenzo to La Venta. This new Olmec hub would grow to a population size of around 18,000 people, and this city would develop an organized, polytheistic religion, which is believed to be the basis for most future Mesoamerican religions. Soon, the Maya, a kingdom to the south, began encroaching into the Yucatan Peninsula, establishing their own urban cities in the region. And, although these two civilizations were both very prominent, there is no evidence that they ever interacted directly. Many other central Mesoamerican peoples began to group into larger urban centers. One of these centers was Teotihuacan. Eventually, due to drastic environmental changes, the main portion of the Olmec territory was abandoned. This emigration is linked to a surge in population of the many urban centers across Mesoamerica. There were vast obsidian deposits around Teotihuacan, which allowed for them to trade and accrue wealth. This trade power allowed for them to become very prominent in the region, and the city began extending its influence. The city became one of the largest in Mexico, and a center for arts such as pottery, with great religious structures. The kingdom came to an end as a drought ravaged the region, and subsequent uprising burned the city, collapsing Teotihuacan. Many city-states attempted to fill the void of power left, but none really rose to the same influence as Teotihuacan, until the Toltec civilization rose. The Toltec were based around a city, but were under the rule of another Mesoamerican nation. They rebelled and were pushed from their homelands. So, the Toltecs created a new settlement where they established a monarchy. Soon, many people from across Mesoamerica began to flock to the Toltec capital, and the Toltec people began to extend their influence greatly throughout Mexico. They became a regional power, building several other cities under their rule. But soon, the Toltec people became divided on the basis of religious practices, and a civil war broke out among the people, due to one faction supporting human sacrifice and the other against it. In the end, the people in support of religious sacrifice came out on top, which led to a widespread diaspora of the losing Toltecs, which also spread the Toltec culture throughout Mesoamerica, specifically the Yucatan Peninsula. After this, the Toltec people wanted to extend their influence further north, but bit off more than they could chew, as the nations that they attacked were able to defeat the kingdom in a series of battles that led to the fall of the Toltec capital. This began another mass migration of people throughout the region, and a long period of warring city-states, with a few coming out on top exerting their influence. These city-states were Texcoco, Culhuacan, and Tepanec. Soon there was a nomadic people that were called the Mexica, or Aztecs, who settled on a hill near Lake Texcoco. But, after some time, they were ousted by the Tepanec, and the Aztecs fled. The Culhuacan people gave the Mexica permission to resettle in their lands, where they built a new city, and the Mexica were subservient to the people who lent them the land. Eventually, the Mexica offered to the Culhuacan leader to make his daughter a goddess in their religion. Obviously wanting his daughter to be revered, the leader allowed for the Mexica to take his child. Unknown to him, the way the Mexica people made someone a god was that they would have to be sacrificed. And when the Culhuacan leader came bearing gifts to the Mexica city, he found that his daughter had been killed. He now chased the Mexica from their homes. The Mexica were forced into the marshes of Lake Texcoco, where they built a new city on an artificial island that they called Tenochtitlan. Here the Mexica people thrived and would centralize their empire. But this land was owned by the Azcapotzalco, who did allow for the Mexica to live there for military service and tribute. This allowed for the Mexica to grow their city under relative protection. Eventually, wanting to be independent, the Mexica people revolted, which began several other independence movements of people that the Azcapotzalco had subjugated. The Mexica gained control of a considerable portion of land, and created an alliance with two other rebelling factions. This alliance would become known as the Aztec Empire. But, as time went on, the members of the alliance merged into the Mexica state and became one large nation. At the same time, the Aztecs drastically expanded their empire. The Aztec nation was also in a constant state of war, as their religious practices required human sacrifice. This allowed them to constantly expand their borders. The wars also allowed the Aztecs to constantly train their warriors to be elite soldiers. Conquered territories would provide tribute to the Aztec state, and would provide the nation with wealth and manpower. At the beginning of the Aztec era, there was a drought which halted their military expansion, and this weakening of the empire allowed for some independent states to take land. But once this drought was over, the empire regained its steam and the expansion started again, just to be slowed down by internal unrest when the Aztec king began expanding his own power. This unrest was eventually quelled. Soon the Purepecha Empire began a war with the Aztecs, where they claimed land and took it. But very soon the Aztecs regrouped and reconquered the territory. And after several failed attempts to push the Aztecs from the land again, the Purepecha were attacked themselves, where they destroyed the attacking force, which led to a ceasefire between the nations. Very soon the Aztec Empire touched both the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific Ocean. But their empire would not expand for much longer, as word of strange men landing on the continent traveled up their trade routes. The first of these men to land in Mexico was a small crew of shipwrecked sailors who were captured by the Maya on the Yucatan Peninsula. Out of the 12 who made it, only 2 survived, most being sacrificed and dying to disease. The 2 men that survived escaped, but were captured by a different Mayan city, where they were kept as slaves. Slowly, as time went on, the men gained the trust of the native people, so much so that eventually one of the men became a war chief. While these 2 sailors found their place in this new world, the Spanish eyed up the potential territory, as they planned an expedition led by Francisco de Córdoba. The expedition first landed on the Yucatan Peninsula, where they traveled towards a Mayan city the Spanish saw from their ships. But on their way there, they were ambushed by the native people, who killed a few men, but they were repulsed. They eventually made it to the outskirts of the city, where the Spanish looted buildings, finding gold, and captured some of the native people before they returned to their ships, hoping to find a more peaceful place to land. Soon the expedition was forced to land to find fresh water, where the Spaniards were surrounded overnight by Mayan warriors who attacked at dawn, killing around half the expeditionaries and injuring many. The only reason some had survived this encounter was a last-ditch effort by the Spanish to concentrate their attack with the goal of reaching their landing vessels and returning to their ships. After this battle, the expedition was finished, with the Spanish never being able to get the water that they so desperately needed. With complete disregard for the stories of Mayan aggression, there was soon another expedition sent, with hopes to discover more gold than the first expedition had. Not much came from this expedition, other than minimal trading and the discovery of the Aztec Empire, which was vastly more rich than the Mayan Empire. A third expedition was sent, led by Herman Cortez, which captured the Mayan city of Cozumel, on an island sharing the same name. Here Spaniards destroyed Mayan religious figures, and had crosses erected in their place. Cortez heard from the locals of the aforementioned shipwrecked men, living with the Mayans. Cortez sent a letter to reunite with these men, but one of the Spaniards, Guerrero, had been assimilated and refused to leave his position as war chief. But the other, Aguilar, happily returned to his fellow countrymen, and would act as a translator for Cortez. The Spanish now left Cozumel and landed near the Mayan city of Potonchan, where they utterly destroyed the Mayan warriors, and would take aboard a woman who spoke the Aztec language to translate for them, as Aguilar only spoke the Mayan language. Soon the expedition departed for Aztec land, hearing of their immense wealth from past expeditions. And, once they landed in Aztec territory, they were met with gifts, servants, and lodgings. The Aztec king Montezuma wasn't sure how to proceed with these foreigners, But while the decision was being made, the Spanish founded the town of Veracruz and had talks with the locals, who were very displeased with the Aztecs, as they were forced to pay immense taxes. The Spanish, seeing an opportunity to topple the empire and claim it for the Spanish crown, marched to a town where they convinced its people to rebel and join their ranks. Around 200 natives joined the Spanish, and the expedition made its way to the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. But, on the way, the men found resistance from the Tlaxcala people, who were in constant war with the Aztecs, and were only kept independent for their people being taken as slaves or for sacrifice. After a few battles, the Tlaxcalans realized that these men were against Montezuma, and allied themselves with Cortez. The Spanish stayed in Tlaxcala to rest for a few weeks while they prepared to fight the Aztecs. While there, the natives were introduced to Christianity, and added the Christian god to their polytheistic religion. Some even were baptized, probably not knowing what it meant. Now, well rested, the Spanish marched on the second largest Aztec city, Cholewa, which was a religious hub. With no resistance, the men entered the city, but were very suspicious of the Aztecs. Under the suspicion of attack, the Spanish rounded up the nobles, killed them, burned down the city, and massacred Choluan citizens. After this incident, Montezuma invited Cortez into his city without resistance, which the Spanish did happily. During talks between the Spanish and Montezuma, the Spanish threatened to kill the Aztec king if he did not act under them. Soon, Cortez left Tenochtitlan to defeat another Spanish man, who was sent to arrest Cortez. Cortez was successful in his mission, and most of the soldiers sent to arrest him ended up joining him. But while Cortez was away, the soldiers he had left behind in Tenochtitlan had slaughtered thousands of natives on one of their holy days, which had caused the capital to enter full-scale revolt, with the people losing faith in their ruler. Once Cortez returned to Tenochtitlan, he sent Montezuma to request peace from his people. But as he addressed them, Montezuma was pelted with rocks until he died. The Spanish now fled the city at night, hoping for a peaceful departure. But they were spotted crossing a bridge, which led to a battle that killed more than half of Cortez's forces. The expedition fled to Tlaxcala and rested. During this time, smallpox had spread from the Spanish to the natives, greatly weakening the Aztecs. And soon, during an all-out offensive on the Aztecs, the combined Tlaxcala and Spanish forces had conquered Tenochtitlan and the Aztec Empire. Tenochtitlan was systematically destroyed and looted, where foundation began for a new city called Mexico City, named so after the Mexica people who used to live there. Cortez called this new land that he had conquered New Spain. He was made governor of these lands, and was granted immunity for past crimes committed. The next few years were spent conquering the native lands, even backstabbing the Tlaxcalans, and erecting new Spanish towns with settlers flowing in. Slavery was widespread and brutal in the Spanish Empire, and missionaries were sent to convert the locals. Most importantly, the colony began exporting massive amounts of New World silver to the homeland of Spain, which caused an economic crash. The land was lawless, as there was very little government involvement in the colony, which allowed for criminals to run rampant. But soon, a liberal viceroy of New Spain was in power, and he made sweeping reforms, such as a highway police force being trained, and he began tackling corruption in the church. This led to animosity, with the clergy and nobles being against the viceroy, as he was limiting their power. So, to combat this, riots were incited by his enemies, and he was ousted. Soon the Bourbon dynasty rose to the Spanish throne and made their own changes, which tightened their control over the colony. This gave more power to the highest nobility, while stripping power from the people. This began an anti-colonial movement in the colony, with the justification of Spanish rule put into question. The Spanish, in the 7 Years' War, wanted to cripple the French by invading Louisiana from Mexico, which didn't go well, as the French had allied with the natives. This defeat restricted the further expansion of New Spain northwards. Also during this war, many Caribbean colonies were attacked, which led to a Mexican standing army being established, and many fortifications erected throughout the colony. Soon the Americans began their war for independence, and a few hundred Mexican soldiers were sent to aid against the British. This revolution inspired many Mexican people and heightened the anti-Spanish sentiment throughout the colony. With the invasion of Spain by Napoleon and the instating of the new Spanish ruler, the Mexican Viceroy saw an opportunity to capitalize off the event by expanding his own power and pleasing the masses at the same time. This was an independence movement, which was popular with everyone but the nobility, who profited from the aforementioned Bourbon reforms, and they feared a loss of their power. Soon, these nobility stormed the viceroy's office and arrested him under suspicious charges, which only sent the colony closer to independence, as mass conspiracies began throughout the colony.